Nice to meet you. Are we
Yeah,
just
you
chatting
too.
or are we going to get started right away?
Yeah, no, yeah, we could get started right away. I mean, so I want to learn more about energy psychology. Wait, I know we talked on the phone for a little bit about that, but I just want to like get it out a little bit more so they understand it.
Okay, well, my name is Kiannaa. And I've been practicing energy psychology pretty much my entire career. Everything is based on perceptions. And because we have these perceptions, if you can imagine, every perception you have is like a string, and that string connects to something, and it connects to something within, and then it connects with externally, like within the universe and so forth. And everything is a harmonic. So energy psychology is really simply just knowing how to follow patterns. And if you are interested in changing those patterns, which most people are, then you can clear and heal those patterns so they're not so problematic. So for example, like addiction. That's a huge pattern, like smoking, alcohol, drugs. At its core is love. And so it's just blocks to love. So in energy psychology, how I approach it is addressing all those areas that are blocking love coming into somebody who is having an addiction, because ultimately all they're looking for is love. So energy psychology is really just approaching it from a systemic perspective, following the patterns. Does that help?
Okay, I see. Yeah, so the patterns are kind of referring to like habits.
It could be a habit for sure, but patterns is really another term for programs, imprints,
Okay, I see.
shadows. Like there's a myriad of things that go into a pattern. So you can get a program or an imprint from your lineage, your history, your parents, your grandparents, your great-great-grandparents. I mean, it's all the way in your DNA. So when I'm addressing somebody's patterns from an energetic perspective, I'm actually clearing through the DNA.
Okay, and so wait, how are you like? What does that mean to clear through the DNA?
Well, clearing is another word for healing, and it just means that you're
Okay, I see.
addressing the DNA within our system. So we have strands of DNA, and those strands of DNA connect to different tools and aptitudes and so forth. Back in high school, they used to call it, you have your carbon DNA, and then they used to call it the junk DNA. Did you
Uh-huh.
have that in school at all?
I don't remember. I don't
Oh,
remember
you don't remember
actually.
that? Well,
Yeah.
they used to refer to it as junk DNA, which is really your crystalline DNA. They just didn't know what it was there for. And the crystalline DNA for a lot of people has not been activated. It's dormant. And so when you're working in a healing capacity and changing patterns, you're working within the crystalline DNA, which is our connection to the divine.
Oh, okay. I see. That's a lot of interest. So that's when we go into consciousness and stuff like that.
Yeah.
You're telling me about that. Okay, cool.
Mm-hmm.
So is a lot of the work then is a matter of like changing or shifting perspective? Is that how you kind of part of the healing?
Well, everything is perspective. So even
Yeah,
consciousness is a new perspective, right?
right.
So even when I was working with teams, and I would do team assessments, right? And so we get all this data on the team of how are they in relationship to a high performing team. And when you look at the data, it's all perspective. You could look at the data and see something that's high and say, oh, I don't need to work on that. Or you can look at it and see, oh, well, this is the lowest number. I definitely need to work on that. The key with perception is just your attention on improvement would improve the numbers across the board. So to me, I would tell the teams, I don't care what you work on, just pick one thing. One thing is going to change all these, but don't believe me. I want you to have your own experience of it, and they would be amazed. And this is how I would take, completely dysfunctional teams and make them into high performing teams.
Wow. Amazing. So what's your typical client?
My typical client is usually hyper analytical because I'm a data kind of girl, and my process usually works really well for them. So in the past, I work with engineers, nuclear engineers, mathematicians, doctors, nurses, somebody who is just really analytical. Engineering is huge. That's where a lot of my background is with my clients, because they like that I put numbers to things that are esoteric to them, like what they would call touchy-feely type things. I put a number to it, and I put a number to how are you feeling today, like on a scale of 0 to 10. And my goal when I get off the call with one of my clients is I want them feeling as close to a 10 as possible, which means that they have to have low stress.
Okay.
And I do that through conversation and energy movement.
Okay, cool. So what they're usually coming to you for what? Like, what's the struggles that they're usually dealing with that gets them attracted to you? Is just like anything within?
It just depends. Most of my business, I would say 99% of my business is all referral. It's been like that for my entire career. Both when I did very corporate work, and now I'm doing more one-on-one since COVID has started. I really kicked in making my work more accessible to common day folks who wouldn't normally have the money or the time to work with somebody who like me. But now I started working with a lot of what's called light workers. So other healers who are struggling in their own development and consciousness and just looking for an outside perspective. For executives, what's happening most recently with my executives is they've gotten promoted. They're presidents, vice presidents of organizations, and they got the career, and now they want to find balance in the rest of their life. Like they're looking to develop themselves and follow and be their most authentic self. And, when you're climbing the corporate ladder, that's not usually a priority.
Right.
But once you're there, it's like, now what?
Comes back to the foundation.
Within this week, I've had 2 clients that I worked with 10 years ago come back. That's not the everyday thing. So my days are not really typical with clients.
Right. Cool. So it sounds like then, it comes back down to your foundation, which is yourself. And I think we talked about like self-awareness is such a huge part of that. And then that's going to go into, I guess, like our topic, which is on like empathy, like what makes somebody empathize and how does empathy work?
Yeah, and empathy is totally connected in simple terms to our ability to have compassion. Right. And you can't empathize without compassion. And when you can have and foster compassion in your life, then you're able to open yourself up to understanding and not necessarily being in agreement with somebody, but have a willingness to put yourself in their shoes. Like, okay, if I were them, how would that feel for me? Mm-hmm. And this is so important, not just professionally, but personally. Since COVID, divorce is up significantly. I mean, everybody's, you have to live with your partner that you married, and, they've changed, and then the stress and the fear, and, divorce is on the plate for a lot of people. But how we learn to communicate and empathize, when people are in high states of fear. And let's be honest, a lot of people are even denying that they're even fearful. They know they're stressed, but they don't want to even acknowledge that their stress is related to fear. Fear of mortality, fear of not seeing their families. And so if you can tap into compassion, then you can begin to empathize.
I see. So it's like almost like once you're in there, you're replacing compassion, you're using compassion instead of fear.
Well, the question was about what is empathy and how do you empathize, right?
Yeah.
And you empathize by compassion. And when you can foster compassion, you lead to understanding, right? And awareness and new perspectives.
Yeah, I see.
But to be an empath is different than empathy. So I don't know if you're asking.
So then with empathy, where do you start with that? Like, where does it start to where you can develop compassion? Because obviously some people, like, we only know as much as we know from our experiences, from what we know. And how I see empathy is, yeah, like you said, like, you're seeking to understand, which comes from compassion. So you're using your willpower to seek to understand and see what that from that person's perspective. So where does that begin and start for some people? Because I know some people, even like with mental illnesses too, bipolar and things like that, they have struggles to be able to do that. So how does someone kind of get to that point where they can shift their perspective into going into empathy and compassion?
Well, one thing I will say is that everybody has their own unique path. And you brought up some good examples of, what people need to learn through. Some of them are traumas and imbalances that might be happening within their energy systems, which is what mental illness is. The first place that I would say for somebody to start to build empathy is to be curious. Curious is a practice. So curious about, I wonder how, I wonder what makes them tick. I'm curious about how things work. Just asking open-ended questions, not just to others, but to yourself, will allow you to unravel this having to know and to be right. Does that make sense? Because I think a lot of times people get really stuck in their ways and like, no, this is what it has to be.
Like, being curious definitely makes sense. But so I'm like wondering, is what makes somebody curious? Is it then that it kind of goes back to them? It's like a person just has to naturally be curious in order for them to empathize. Otherwise, they're not going to end up empathizing. Or is there something that a person can do in order to develop more empathy?
Yeah, absolutely. There are things that people can do. But the first part still needs to be like, okay, I'm going to commit to practicing. Right. And I think it's a practice and a skill to be curious. For me, like since I was a little girl, I've always been curious. Always. I've always wondered what made people tick, why people were doing things a particular way, not from a place of judgment, just like total curious. And I fostered that. And I just always have asked questions. I even had like a psychic when I went to a psychic once, right, saying, what are you in HR or something? You ask a lot of questions.
I've always been that too. Yeah. That kind of got me here.
I'm not HR.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. What?
No, I was just saying that's kind of what got me here too. Like, I just like sitting here asking questions and learning from people. So it's really cool. But yeah, curious. So it just starts kind of with your own willingness, like willpower and free will to be curious and to ask questions and to seek to understand. And that's kind of where empathy gets built.
It's a practice. It absolutely is a practice. And I think it's important to seek to understand from a place of an open heart. I say, so if there's any blocks that energetically people can feel most, is that they're in their head, stressed, overwhelmed, preoccupied, strategizing, all those things are in the mind. Yeah. That disconnects you from your heart. So the curiosity, how do I connect with my heart, would be a good way to start with empathy. How can I connect with my heart in this situation? Is my heart open or closed? And just start to ask yourself questions. The first place to be curious is always within yourself. Like, right. For me, if somebody asks me a question and I respond, no, I'm asking myself, geez, Kiannaa, what's going on? Why were you so strong with that? No, and I'll go into inquiry within myself. Now, I think a lot of people might think that's crazy. It takes a lot of time, but I thoroughly enjoy it. Right. I love learning how I even tick, and I challenge my beliefs. And that's another thing that people can do, that's is true. Challenge old beliefs that no longer serve who you are becoming.
Right. I see. So empathy really takes a big part of it is self-awareness, is to understand yourself, to seek to understand yourself. Because the more you understand yourself, that means the better you can understand others to that same extent and seek to understand them. And even comes down to communication too, because the more you can empathize and the more you can communicate, and communication is the foundation of all relationships and pretty much everything. I mean, we take everything that exists. I always, tell people this: if you take everything that exists in this world away, all you have left is your relationships, people, and community. Like, relationships built this world. So empathy is the foundation. Self-awareness is the foundation of creating all healing and everything that we have.
Well, it certainly is a foundation of a healer and a good healer. Not all healers work from that space of love and compassion. Right.
And then for some people, I was wondering, as you're speaking, what about people who have struggles with empathy, such as, like, I don't know, narcissists? I don't know if you know much about that. I'm assuming you do, but like with people like that, can they change? Is there a way for them to develop more empathy?
Well, what I would say is that my name got passed around in a group of narcissists. And so I had for weeks and weeks, I had narcissist booking sessions. So what are the chances of that?
Yeah.
The owner of the group, and also there was 2 owners of the group, and they circulated my information, and I had a whole slew of narcissists booking sessions. And the thing is about narcissists is they don't always know that they're a narcissist, right? And all a narcissist really is, honestly, is an imbalance in ego. We all have ego, but if we have an imbalance of ego, then we can go to extreme measures, which is what a narcissist does. And my record for working with narcissists is excellent. And it doesn't take much at all. It's one session.
Wow. So you could shift. How do you go about doing that and helping balance the ego?
Well, I do it energetically. I find the pattern, and obviously there's a pattern there for narcissists. So if you are attracting narcissists, that's an indicator that you have a harmonic of a narcissist. And a narcissist would be really somebody who has some unworthiness issues, which is very common, right? And so you can't attract somebody into your life unless you have a frequency that's allowing it. And sometimes, people get really mad at narcissists because of who they are and how they act. Yeah. And I can relate. I've had some in my life, and they can be very manipulating. And so you don't really know that they're a narcissist, right? You don't see it all, the pattern. Right. So apparently, even for me, and I'm very aware because it's very sneaky how it shows up. But when I had it in my life, there were lessons that I needed to learn. And until I learned that lesson, and a lot of my work is helping people identify and integrate their lessons so they don't have to keep going through the patterns. And everything is a pattern.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Well, it's so interesting.
Pattern, lines, a pattern, manipulation, all of that.
Right. I see. So like you said that if you are attracting narcissists into your life, then you might have some of the same tendencies, or you said something like that?
Well, absolutely. We would have definitely have learning, but you would have a harmonic in order to attract that into your life, because we're always creating what it is that we need to learn and wake up. Like, let's just use our president for an example, who is all about me. Right? President Trump, I think he would probably admit, he likes the attention, and he likes to be right, and he likes to create narratives, there's nothing wrong with those things. But, he is a part of our collective reality. So we all must have needed this to wake up. We do not attract people, especially in a massive way, for us not to wake up. And people are waking up, and the waking up process can be excruciatingly painful, and it's going to get worse.
Wow, interesting. Okay, cool. Well, so it just starts with basically the foundation of it is being curious, and narcissists could get out of it as long as they're technically committed to wanting to make a change, because whatever their pattern is, they're getting themselves into situations that they don't like, and they realize that, and it kind of gets to that point where they want to make a change. Is that usually how that
Well,
work?
a narcissist wouldn't come to me and say, hey, Kiannaa, I'm a narcissist. Can you help me with that?
Right.
They don't know that they're a narcissist, but I can pick up an imbalance
That
in their energy of the ego. And so I'll just check in, and they'll tell stories. And by the stories is how I get and pick up more patterns and get more data. So I wouldn't tell somebody, oh, you're a narcissist, because people are very offended by that, because there's so much projections about how bad a narcissist is. They're not bad people. They're just people who have a really deep harmonic of unworthiness and a need to be validated outside of themselves. Now, if we can have compassion for people like that, it switches us, because then we don't have the resistance to them. And when we don't have resistance, we don't pull that in. If you think of it like a magnet, right? So resistance actually pulls what you don't like in. So the hate and the disdain and the anger that people feel towards people who have been in relationships with narcissists, that brings them in.
Right. I say, yeah, no one likes the label of that. And I think that also relates to a lot of mental illnesses that people oversee, especially these days, where like bipolar or narcissism, sociopath, all that. And they see those people as bad, but that's where they're not empathizing, having that compassion to understand that they're living in their own reality or whatever. And they just need that help and the healing and so when you see that pattern in someone, I mean, what's your next approach? Like, how do you approach that?
How do I approach the pattern of somebody who's like a narcissist?
Like, for example, yeah, like saying that kind of like it's all about themselves. Cause reading a lot about narcissism, they say it's hard for them to change because they have to really want to change and kind of realize that. So it's like, what's the approach or the questions that you ask them to help them become self-aware? I
don't have to ask, because once they show up in a session for me, I don't have to bring to their attention that they're a narcissist. I might just say, do you find that your ego sometimes gets in the way, or your pride? I might ask questions like that. Yeah. But the thing is like, nobody really wants to acknowledge, myself included, and I've had some unworthiness type situations, and it takes a willingness to just go there with yourself. An imbalanced ego, most people who have that know that they're acting out of pride and their pride is getting in the way, they already have a level of self-awareness. Somebody who's on the extreme, like a narcissist, they wouldn't have that, because the narcissistic behavior is put in place to protect them. It's a protection mechanism. It's nothing more than that. And again, if we can have compassion for somebody that has been traumatized so much, and there's usually big trauma underneath all of that created that behavior. But most of the time, people don't see that because they weren't a part of that trauma. They're just the recipient of the behavior that hurts.
I see. So like, how do you have compassion? What's an example of having compassion for someone who kind of takes all of the blame, that you're not the blame, but they kind of put the blame back on other people for whatever it might be or whatever the situation is? And because I've had narcissists in my life before, and it's like, no matter even how much I empathize, how much I am compassionate to them and try to show that I understand them and accept them for who they are, no matter what, nothing changes. It's still the blame back on them. Like, how does that?
Well, you never change them. Like, you're not in business of changing and making them aware. So your job is always your own self-awareness and asking yourself, how can I be more compassionate to them? How can I show more love? How can I speak to them with love and compassion? That's your growth. Your job is not to wake them up to their own pain. I mean, because that's really somebody who is in a lot of pain. What you could do is, hey, you might consider having a session with this person, Kiannaa, about, conflict coming up in your life, or maybe you're not getting along with your job, and I would be able to pick up on that behavior, and so they would be coming for something else, but they get so much more. And then It is a new learning for people who have been, let's just say, imbalanced in their ego, and then I balance their ego. They still have to make some conscious choices to do new behavior. And that is something that gets learned. And if they don't know how to learn it, and they don't, like, let's say, have continued sessions, then it's easy to go back to the behavior, but they will not go back 100%. They will still have episodes. So like, I'll have a client that'll say, call me and say, Kiannaa, you'd be so proud. I was really upset about what my boss was doing or what I thought they were doing. And I only was mad for 24 hours. And then I realized I'm really in a much better situation than I thought. So they had a set, and this is somebody who's in my energy recalibration. So they get monthly clearings. And now they have the awareness to check themselves. So a narcissist might stay mad and angry for weeks, months, and years at people and harbor real energy towards other people. Whereas this person was able to let it go in 24 hours. Whereas their past behavior was to be angry for months.
Right. So have you had people come in and then basically look at you in a negative way and say like, this isn't working and it's like not helping, or like have those types of struggles?
I personally, I mean, people aren't going to come and pay, I don't think, and say this isn't working. I've never had that experience within, I'm not saying that it can't be possible, right. But I really do work for my sessions, even when I do donation sessions where people pay whatever they want. I do donation Mondays, and people can just book a session for 30 minutes and they pay whatever they want, and they get a 30-minute session. And at the end of the 30 minutes, for example, I might say, how stressed are you today? Depending on what they're coming for. And they could be a 9 or a 10. I said, okay, we're going to get you to a 0. Are you open to being at a 0 as far as stress? And they're like, yeah. And so usually by the end of the session, they can't even believe that they can feel that different. But that's how quick it happens. Change can happen very quickly when you're working in the quantum realm. The quantum realm, energy moves super fast. When we're here in our physical world, there's a lot of density. Density comes from many, many things, but that's really what keeps us from feeling better. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm trying to process that. It's interesting. Like, what were you saying about density and making that like us feel better? Or what did you mean by that?
Well, density does not make us feel better. Density is what keeps us from becoming more conscious, more awake. So if you want to access higher levels of consciousness, and I know that was something that you wanted to talk about a little bit. If you want to access higher levels of consciousness, the first thing one of the things that you have to do, besides being curious, is remove density. And density is a heavy energy. That's an energy of stress, overwhelm, fatigue, frustration, anger. Those are all high density emotions. But then there's also density in foods and in our environments. So density is everywhere.
Okay, cool. So when you say density, you're meaning the struggles or the things that they're dealing with, or when you said that it's in diet and things like that, what do you mean by that?
Well, that's a physical manifestation of how density would equal. So for example, if you have a steak, that's high density. It takes a lot more to process. You're actually processing the animal or the cow, for this example, their energy and their emotional state, and that's getting integrated into your body as you process it. So it takes longer to process it. Whereas if you had a salad, that's a light density.
Okay, I see. Cool. And then, so as for reaching higher consciousness, now we're talking about it. How would you describe consciousness? Like, what is consciousness and what does that mean?
Well, consciousness is just really a state of being, and it's an access point in simple terms. And there's all different levels of consciousness.
Right. Okay. So like, meaning like kind of being more aware. I mean, like more aware and conscious of things. Because when you say it's a state of mind. Like, what is that like?
It's a state of being.
State of
So it's how open and accessible and willing you are to access different energy realms, because consciousness is an energy. It's not a stagnant place. It's fluid, it's changing, and as you are changing, you're fluid and always changing. So a big consciousness that most people know of but aren't aware of is fear consciousness. Cancer is a consciousness. Those are all different levels of consciousness, and they have a vibration and a frequency. And so you must have a harmonic to vibrate with that energy.
Okay, I see. So yeah, so when like someone their consciousness is expanding, they're reaching the higher state, it's just that they see more, or is that basically what you're saying?
Oh yeah, you see more, you hear more, you feel more, you have more access. Everything is expanded.
Right.
You don't see things as one point. That one point influences everything. So the name of my companies are In Sync Consulting and Being in Sync. Synchronicity,
Yeah.
it means everything is connected. There is not one thing in this world that happens that doesn't cause a ripple. Like, hopefully from this conversation, we'll create some curiosity and some ripples for people to see things in a different way, right?
Right. Awesome. So basically it all starts with being in sync with yourself, self-awareness, and it comes down to that, and that leads to the empathy, and then that leads to the conscious expansion, right?
Yeah, well, being in sync will definitely open up your world.
Right. Awesome. Okay. And then I know we were talking about, like, the title is Finding Peace Within Chaos. So is all this and everything we talked about basically the process of finding peace within chaos and being in tune and in sync with yourself, that you bring peace to the situations and the experiences you have in life? You don't find peace. You are the peace. You bring the peace.
You are the peace. And also, chaos is a perspective, right? And so you have the opportunity to reframe everything that you are seeing and how you are experiencing it. So for example, for when I'm feeling triggered or charged by something that bothers me in a way that makes me feel uncomfortable, I want to know why. Like, why am I not able to find compassion for this person? Why do they irritate me? And we see this on TV all the time, right? If you watch the news, you're going to be triggered by something like insane that somebody is doing. You're like, why are they doing this? This makes no sense. But when there is chaos in the energy, which there is a lot of chaos going in our energy fields right now, we have all kinds of magnetic, we have all kinds of influences, which changes how we interpret things. And so chaos is really a perspective, and we can bring peace to any situation through raising our energy, our frequency, our vibration, and higher levels of consciousness, and inviting it in. And that's all it really takes. So to go back to what is consciousness and how do we reach higher levels, a lot of times it's as simple as an invitation and inviting a higher level of consciousness in to your situation or relationship or something like that, even a conversation.
Yeah. So, and that sounds like it's more about, being open-minded, and kind of comes down to being that curiosity. And what about for some people who they think in their mind that they're being curious, but they reach a wall, and it kind of gets to a point where we could see it on the outside that they're not seeking as much as they think they are. There's always that question. How do you deal with that? I guess it's kind of, if you know.
Well, usually there's a block energetically with somebody that might keep them from going the next steps. And they may not. That's why it's so helpful to work with somebody like me, because they may not understand or see what the block is because they don't see patterns, let's say, for example. And so That's why you would ask a good friend or somebody, work with somebody like me who would give you a new perspective of looking at things and
Right.
open your possibilities up, because there's always more than one possibility. There's always potentials.
I see. So you're helping almost spark curiosity in a way by asking the right question, kind of opening their mind up to new perspective.
You mean in a session?
Yeah.
In a session, it's not really about that necessarily. Usually in a session, a typical session with me would go like this. Kiannaa, I want to have a 30-minute session or an hour or 90 minutes. A 90-minute session is what I call a quantum leap. And that's when you're going to have a complete shift in how you're seeing, experiencing, and perceiving your experience, your life. You will end those sessions with a higher level of consciousness. How you maintain it is still your free will. So people can come to me and say, okay, I want to have a session. What do I need to do to prepare? And I say, okay, you're going to do 30 minutes, 1 to 3 things, depending on what those things are, and we will address them. Now, they may have something bigger going on that they don't even have an awareness of. So, for example, one person booked a 30-minute session and they had what I would call energy attachments. And energy attachments would be a huge block for consciousness. Huge. If you have these things, it is very difficult to reach higher levels of consciousness, because these attachments basically are like a heavy weight. A lot of quote unquote autistic children are super vulnerable, and the reason why they are acting out oftentimes is because they have attachments, and their energy fields need to be stronger. So I would have to address those attachments and then get to their 1 to 2, 3 things. Does that make sense?
I see. Okay. So how do you go about that detachment or whatever it is, kind of moving them away from overcoming the energy attachment?
So if somebody comes to me and they have these 3 things, but I see other things that need to be addressed as a priority, I always bring that up in the conversation and saying, I can't get to these until I deal with this. So, and then I'll say, do you have trouble sleeping? Do you crave lots of sugars and carbohydrates and like that? Do you have thoughts that you don't really, they're not your thoughts, but you have these thoughts and you sometimes think you're crazy, and almost always they say yes. Because when I am feeling into somebody, I feel their energy. So oftentimes the night before when I have dreams, I'll have the experience that they're having. So for example, I'll feel anxious, which is not my normal. I can't sleep, or I'll be restless. And then the next day I'll have a session and I say, well, do you have trouble sleeping? Do you feel restless? And one time somebody actually said there is this being that sits on my bed and scares me. And
Wow.
I've never told anybody this because I think I'm crazy for thinking this. And they were 100% right. But because it seems so out of this world that you can't have those things happen, they don't know where do you go to fix that?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And so I cleared that, and they've been sleeping fine ever since. And they're now a regular client.
Wow, that's amazing. So what is the biggest block that you usually come to with people? Is it kind of just the ego gets in the way? Is that just kind of what that it comes down to?
The biggest block, I think the biggest issue that most people, I don't know that block, but I would say the biggest issue that people come into a session with usually is stress and fear.
Oh, yeah.
And then usually those are related to some kind of discord in their relationships, whether it's a marriage or a boyfriend or an ex-husband who's not communicating well, or whatever the situation may be.
I see. Okay. Yeah.
It varies.
Yeah, definitely. And so when you said, like, just back to the concept of balancing the ego, how would you describe the ego?
The ego is really just a tool. Just like our intuition is a tool, our ego is a tool. And it was never intended to drive our decisions and our choices. It was always a tool for us to access.
Yeah.
And just like our intuition. So that's how I see the ego. It's not a bad thing. I think we've been conditioned to see the ego as almost like a bad thing, but the ego isn't a bad thing. It's part of who we are and our amazing structures with so many tools to access.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, part of being human now makes perfect sense, and you're helping them kind of balance that to use in their life. So I think that was amazing. Everything we went over, I mean, we covered a lot of awesome topics. I think it's really cool. I really appreciate how you coming on and just sharing all of that. Is there anything else that you'd want to add?
Well, that anybody can reach me at Kiannaa.com, Kiannaa, 2 N's and 2 A's. And just reach out with any questions that you might have. I'm happy to respond, and they can find me on social medias as well.
Perfect. Awesome. Yeah. Thanks again for coming on. I appreciate it.